Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome back to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight begins our peaceful journey through ancient Egyptian pharaohs, a magnificent civilization that built eternal monuments and revolutionized the ancient world from 2686 to 30 BC. In part 1, we'll softly explore the extraordinary reigns of Khufu and Akhenaten, from the builder of the Great Pyramid who created wonders that still astound us today, to the heretic pharaoh who dared to change the gods themselves, all while ancient Egypt reached both its greatest heights and most controversial transformations. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to like this video, leave a gentle comment about which pharaoh fascinates you more, the pyramid builder or the religious revolutionary, and subscribe to keep these soothing tales coming your way. So cozy up, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from the golden sands of ancient Egypt lull you into restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. The pharaoh, known by history as Pharaoh Khufu, came into this world during the latter half of the 27th century BC. In the Old Kingdom of ancient Egypt, Khufu's father was most likely Pharaoh Sneferu. As in Old Kingdom Egypt, something similar to primogeniture was practiced, where the eldest son of the previous ruler would inherit the throne upon his death. Since Sneferu had many sons, it would have been very unlikely that one of them did not succeed him. Sneferu was clearly one of the most powerful rulers ancient Egypt had ever seen, and as we will see, his pyramid-building activities were a major influence on Khufu. Khufu's mother, if Sneferu was indeed his father, was Queen Hetepheres I, Egyptian. Rulers practiced polygamy, and Sneferu would have had many wives, with Hetepheres perhaps only rising to become an important figure at the royal court in the capital, Men-Nefer, just to the south of modern-day Cairo, when it became clear that her son Khufu would succeed Sneferu one day. Due to the polygamy practiced by the pharaohs, Khufu had a large number of siblings, many of them being half-brothers and half-sisters. The estimates of Khufu's time of birth are based for the most part on lists of ancient Egyptian kings, which show that his direct predecessor, Pharaoh Sneferu, died around 2590 BC. Since he had reigned for a long time, most likely around 25 years, or longer, it is reasonable to assume that Khufu was well into his adult years when he succeeded to the throne, and that, as such, he may have been born sometime between 2640 BC and 2620 BC. Unfortunately, though, it is not possible to be more exact, given the fragmentary nature and very limited extent of the sources available for a period of history some 4,600 years ago. Khufu is one of the most famous pharaohs of ancient Egypt, and even people who have never heard of him will be aware of the monument which he had built during his reign, the Great Pyramid of Giza, the largest of the pyramids on the Giza Plateau, outside Cairo in Egypt, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and the only one of those 7 wonders still standing today. This enormous monument was built as his tomb, his resting place in death, and a statement of his position as a god on earth in his own time. But Khufu presents something of a historical puzzle. While the Great Pyramid stands as a lasting testament to his reign, we know very, very little about the man himself. Almost no written records of any kind have survived from this time, as papyrus documents can only survive over such long periods if preserved in unusual circumstances. Through other sources of evidence, however, such as ancient inscriptions on temple and tomb walls, the writings of classical authors, archaeological research, and the enormous piece of evidence that the Great Pyramid itself represents, a certain amount about Khufu, his life, and reign can be reconstructed. Khufu ruled Egypt during the Old Kingdom period of Egyptian history. Ancient Egyptian history is divided into nearly a dozen different distinct eras. The first such era was the pre-dynastic period of Egyptian history, running from the late 5th millennium BC down to about 3100 BC. This was a long period in which there was no major centralized government in Egypt. Furthermore, Lower Egypt around the Nile Delta and Upper Egypt further south along the course of the Nile were not yet united as a kingdom, but a common culture was emerging here centered on trade, agricultural practices, a religious system, and of course, the development of The hieroglyphic writing system, late in the period. The second such period began around 3100 BC, when a ruler by the name of Narmer succeeded in uniting Upper and Lower Egypt under his rule and established the first dynasty of pharaohs, the term pharaoh meaning something similar to great house, and initially referring to a palace in which the ruler lived, but later being applied to describe the king himself during the New Kingdom period. These pharaohs were soon being identified as living gods of a sort, a designation which is important to bear in mind when considering how a pharaoh such as Khufu was able to use so many resources in Egypt, all with the goal of building himself an elaborate tomb. Narmer and his successors in the first and second dynasty reigned down to just beyond 2700 BC in a period known as the early dynastic era. Then, around 2670 BC, the third era of ancient Egyptian history began with the rise of the third dynasty, the Old Kingdom era. The Old Kingdom era would last between around 2670 BC and 2180 BC. It consisted of 6 dynasties, the third dynasty to the 8th dynasty. This was the first period of great cultural flourishing in ancient Egypt, when a powerful centralized state began building brilliant monuments, and its powerful armies expanded the state west into what is now Libya, east into the Sinai Peninsula, and south towards Nubia in modern-day Sudan. Khufu belonged to the 4th dynasty, a specific line of Egyptian pharaohs that ruled between approximately 2630 BC and 2500 BC. We know this because a number of different lists of ancient Egypt's pharaohs have survived, such as the Abydos king list, found on the wall of a temple built by Seti I around 1300 BC. By the time this 4th dynasty came to power, the Old Kingdom was a well-developed state, with armies that controlled extensive territory, a large bureaucracy of scribes and administrators that managed complex construction programs and collected taxes, generally in the form of agricultural goods produced on the rich soil deposited along the shores of the River Nile every year during its flooding. A royal capital had also emerged at Mennefer, or Memphis, just south of modern-day Cairo, and not far from the Giza plateau and the Dashur necropolis, where a complex of burial tombs and pyramids were already being built to house the remains of the pharaohs, members of their families, and leading figures within the government. This was the context in which Khufu would rule Egypt. Depending on which tradition one is reading, one will encounter different names for Khufu. For instance, while Egyptologists and most scholars today use the name Khufu for him, if you pick up a history book written in the middle of the 20th century, you are just as likely to find the builder of the Great Pyramid referred to as Cheops. This is not technically wrong, but Cheops was the rendering of his name in ancient Greek, and the version used by ancient Greek writers like Herodotus, to whom we will return shortly. Khufu's proper and full Egyptian name was Khnum Khufu, the Khnum part being the name of an Egyptian deity who in the Old Kingdom period was viewed as both a god of the River Nile, the waterway which allowed life and civilization to flourish in the otherwise hostile desert, and also a creator god of sorts, who was said to have molded humanity from clay using a potter's wheel. Khnum would be overtaken in importance within the Egyptian religious system in centuries to come by Ra, the sun god, and Amun, but Khnum was much more important in the Old Kingdom. Khnum Khufu means protected by Khnum, and the name was intended to indicate that Khufu had the divine blessing of the gods. Another version still of Khufu's name used by Egyptian writers of a later era was Sufis, a different Greek version of Cheops. Just as the time of his birth and the parentage of Khufu are not precisely known, so too is there uncertainty about when he came to the throne and how long he reigned for. The king lists, such as those at Abydos and elsewhere, differ somewhat in their data, but they all point broadly to Sneferu dying in the early 26th century BC and Khufu succeeding him. We can conservatively say then that he succeeded around 2590 BC. There are differing traditions concerning how long Khufu ruled. One or two anomalies suggest a reign of as much as half a century or longer, though for the most part, the sources agree that he ruled for a period of about 25 to 30 years. So, down to around 2565 BC or thereabouts. If this is the case, then working backwards from all of this, we might conclude that Khufu lived to be a man of about 60 or so years, and would have been entering old age by the standards of the time when he died. When he became pharaoh, the Old Kingdom was enjoying a period of unprecedented power and prosperity, and was extending its influence into new territories beyond the valley and delta of the River Nile. One such area that Khufu was broadly responsible for the conquest of was the Sinai Peninsula. Lying to the east of Egypt in the region connecting Egypt to the wider Middle East, the Sinai Peninsula was a region that was rich in valuable resources in ancient times, as enormous copper mines were discovered at Timna, while various other minerals were mined here, including gold and turquoise, the former being a mineral that was used extensively in ancient Egyptian jewelry and burial goods. At Wadi Maghara, a site in the southwest of the Sinai Peninsula, there are mines and caves that are the remnants of the mining activity undertaken here in ancient times, ones in which cartouche reliefs of Khufu have been found, indicating that he sent mining expeditions here during his reign. There is also evidence of further trade connections being cultivated between Egypt and the Levant during his rule to acquire goods such as the valuable byblos wood produced here. Archaeologists have also located a fort known as Tel Ras Budran in western Sinai. This lay across the Gulf of Suez from the port of Wadi Maghara, and it has been speculated that mined resources were being shipped across the Gulf and then transported overland to Mennefer during Khufu's reign. The riverine transport links between Sinai and the west of the Gulf of Suez point towards the growing Egyptian presence along the Red Sea coastline. In the pre-dynastic and early dynastic era, the rulers of the Egyptian kingdom had been focused on extending their control along the course of the River Nile and uniting Upper and Lower Egypt fully under their rule. With this completed, the next logical phase of expansion was west and eastwards into the oases of the Western Desert and to the Red Sea coast. There are numerous settlement sites along the Red Sea coast, which point towards increased activity here during Khufu's reign. A very notable one is at Wadi al-Jarf, about 100 kilometers south along the Red Sea coast from the modern-day town of Suez. Here, the oldest known artificial harbour anywhere in the world was built right around the time of Khufu's reign, while dozens of anchors dating to the Old Kingdom period have also been excavated from the seabed, indicating a very high level of maritime traffic in Khufu's time. While the evidence is typically fragmentary, the overwhelming sense conveyed by sites like Wadi al-Jarf is of a growing level of prosperity and commerce during Khufu's reign. Because members of the royal family were buried after death in elaborate tombs and often had their names inscribed on temple walls or on other public monuments, we are able to reconstruct Khufu's family to some extent. Like virtually all pharaohs, he had multiple wives. The senior queen was Meritites I, who was most likely a half-sister of Khufu's. It was also a common practice over 3,000 years of ancient Egyptian history for siblings to marry one another to secure the royal line. Her important position amongst Khufu's wives is evident from the building of a small pyramid in honor of her not far from the Great Pyramid on the Giza plateau. Another wife, Akhenaten, is listed on the Inventory Stela, a stone tablet dating from the 7th century BC, which claims to list statues from a temple first built in Egypt during the Old Kingdom period. These wives, and perhaps other unknown wives, bore Khufu at least a dozen children. The eldest son was Kawab, who might otherwise have become pharaoh one day, but died before his father. Another son was Khafra, who would become the most significant of his sons. A daughter, Nefertiabet, meaning beautiful one of the East, has her own important place in the history of the Old Kingdom on account of a slab stela from her tomb at Giza having survived in a remarkable state of preservation. This is full of hieroglyphs and depicts her seated and eating. Despite having occurred nearly 5 millennia ago, we are fortunate to have a few pieces of material evidence that have survived from Khufu's reign to shed light on him and his court. One of these is known as the Westcar Papyrus, so called because it was acquired by a British adventurer by the name of Henry Westcar while in Egypt in the mid-1820s. Unfortunately, we do not know how Westcar acquired it or where it was preserved, as it is extremely rare that a papyrus manuscript could have survived so long without literally disintegrating just by being exposed to the air. The papyrus comes from the middle of the 2nd millennium BC, but is a collection of 5 stories about miracles that were performed by magicians and priests at Khufu's court, with these tales described as King Khufu and the magicians within. The text. The stories are each told by one of Khufu's sons. Only the fourth relates directly to the king and outlines a tale of a man who could reattach the heads to animals and bring them back to life after they were beheaded. Khufu had this ancient Egyptian reanimator brought to his court to demonstrate this magic, and there the pharaoh had numerous animals and even a servant beheaded in order for the magician to demonstrate his skill. On the one hand, the picture presented of Khufu is fairly unflattering. He has animals and a person murdered and beheaded before him in order to test the skill of the magician. But other Egyptologists have pointed out that the story is trying to portray Khufu as an inquisitive ruler, curious about magic and possible religious powers. Another artifact which has survived to shed light on Khufu is the Khufu statuette. This is a remarkable survival. It is a very small ivory statue depicting Khufu and supposedly dating to the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, though many prominent Egyptologists have expressed skepticism that it dates to Khufu's own time. It shows the pharaoh seated on a throne and wearing the red crown of Lower Egypt. We know it is meant to depict the pharaoh as a cartouche on the side of the statue, gives his name as Khnum Khufu, the god name of the king. Found in 1903 by Sir Flinders Petrie, a British archaeologist who pioneered many modern methods of rigorous archaeology. It is housed today in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Beyond this material culture, we have numerous works from antiquity which discuss Khufu and his reign, though even these are set at a significant remove from the pharaoh's own time. One such writer was Manetho, an Egyptian priest and scholar of the 3rd century BC, who composed a major study of the pharaohs of Egypt, entitled the Egyptica, or History of Egypt. His writings have only survived in fragmentary form, but one section addresses Khufu, whom he called Sufis Worm. We know that he was referring to Khufu as he listed him as being the 2nd pharaoh of the 4th dynasty, which Khufu indeed was. In general, Manetho's account is hard to take at face value. While Khufu did reign for several decades, Manetho claimed he did so for 63 years, far too long to match with the archaeological record or the other existing king lists. He does state that Khufu, quote, reared the Great Pyramid. Intriguingly, Manetho claimed that the pharaoh was contemptuous of the gods early on in his reign, but that he then made amends for his actions by composing a sacred book. Egyptologists generally doubt this assertion, as Egyptian kings were not known to write books of any kind, and certainly not so early in Egyptian history. But one wonders what tradition Manetho was drawing on in stating this about Khufu. Manetho cited a Greek writer of the 5th century BC in his short passage on Khufu, noting that Herodotus, the father of history, famous for authoring the Histories, an account of the rise of the Persian Empire and the Persian invasions of Greece in the early 5th century BC, referred to a pharaoh called Cheops as being the builder of the Great Pyramid. Manetho did not realize that Cheops was the Greek name for Khufu. The first half of Herodotus's Histories is actually a mix of geography, anthropology, and fantastical stories which describe the known world at that time and the people in it. In the midst of this, Herodotus turns to consider Khufu, claiming that he had been informed by the priests of Egypt that the country had been well governed until the reign of Khufu, who then, quote, brought the people to utter misery by shutting up all the temples so that none could sacrifice there, and next he compelled all the Egyptians to work for him, appointing some to drag stones from the quarries in the Arabian mountains to the Nile. He went on to suggest that such was Khufu's love of money and power that he had even prostituted one of his daughters to make money from her, though we can probably discount Herodotus's claim that each of the stones used in the Great Pyramid of Cheops was donated by one of her customers. Herodotus's account needs to be taken with a healthy degree of skepticism, given how fantastical some of the material in his histories was, but it is interesting that he claimed he had learned all of this from the priests of Egypt who passed on these traditions and knowledge from generation to generation. Herodotus was not alone in portraying Khufu in this manner. In the 1st century BC, a Greek historian from Sicily, Diodorus Siculus, composed an enormous history of the world called the Bibliotheca Historica, the Library of History. Only 15 of the 40 books into which this was divided have survived, but amongst those that we still have today was a section on Khufu. Referring to him as Chemis, a derivation of the Greek Cheops, he notes that he built the largest of the three Great Pyramids at Giza, a complex which Diodorus noted was already considered one of the seven wonders of the world at that time. Diodorus marveled at how the pyramids could have been built without any evidence being left behind of the construction work. Yet he agreed with Herodotus that Khufu was a tyrant who had committed what he termed many cruel and violent acts, and under whom the Egyptians suffered many hardships. It should be noted in saying this that both Herodotus and Diodorus were deeply confused about the dating of Khufu's reign, claiming it came after the Ramesside period of Egyptian history during which a long succession of pharaohs, generally all called Ramesses, ruled. This Ramesside era occurred in the 13th and 12th centuries BC, nearly a millennium and a half after Khufu's time, so both Herodotus and Diodorus were completely wrong in this. Though Diodorus did note that another tradition held that the pyramids had been built over 3,000 years earlier, a dating which was much more accurate. While each of these ancient accounts need to be treated with caution, it is interesting that there was a unanimous sense, whether in the writings of Herodotus, Manetho, or Diodorus, that Khufu had been an oppressive tyrant. This alleged tyranny was all connected to the foremost accomplishment of Khufu's reign, the building of the Great Pyramid of Giza. At the time of his birth, the building of pyramids to act as tombs for deceased pharaohs had been underway for about a century. The first pharaoh to do so was Pharaoh Giza of the 3rd dynasty, when he had the step pyramid built at Saqqara, to the south of modern-day Cairo. This stood over 60 meters high and was built in 6 large tiers. Were it not for what followed it, it would be considered an enormous achievement for an ancient civilization, but it would soon be dwarfed by more impressive pyramids. Sneferu, who is believed to have been Khufu's father and the founder of the 4th dynasty, was responsible for building 3 pyramids during his long reign which foreshadowed the work of Khufu. These were the Pyramid of Meidum, the Red Pyramid, and the Bent Pyramid. Of these, the Red Pyramid and the Bent Pyramid are the most elaborate, both reaching over 100 meters in height. The Red Pyramid was the most sophisticated pyramid built in Egypt up to that time, being a true pyramid in terms of its mathematical proportions, although the Bent Pyramid has a point of interest in terms of its unusual shape, and in that it is the only pyramid existing in Egypt today that retains a substantial amount of its limestone casing. Not all pyramids from early on in the Old Kingdom era were as accomplished. Some were rough mounds, and some collapsed, either during the reigns of their rulers or not long after, indicating that by the time Khufu came to the throne, there had been an extended period of trial and error when it came to pyramid construction, which he was the beneficiary of. Sneferu was clearly obsessive about pyramid construction, not just in that he was responsible for ordering the construction of several pyramids, but also because he moved on to build new ones, always in search of a more architecturally sophisticated structure. If Khufu was his son, it is interesting to speculate that he inherited his interest in pyramids from his father, perhaps visiting the site of the Bent and Red Pyramid as they were under construction on the Dasha necropolis during his childhood. It was not far away where Khufu chose to begin building a new complex on the Giza plateau, a necropolis which towers over the River Nile valley below, and which would have made the pyramid he chose to build here look particularly imposing in ancient times. Khufu's pyramid would also dwarf his father's. The Great Pyramid stood over 146 meters high when it was built, while the structure was a perfect square on the base, measuring 230 meters on each side. To put that in perspective, it is about 2.5 times longer than the average modern football field and 5 times wider. The sheer amount of material used to build Khufu's Great Pyramid was staggering. It has been estimated that the core of the pyramid consisted of 2.3 million blocks, many measuring well over a meter on the sides, and weighing an average of about 2.5 tons per block. That means that over 6 million tons of stone needed to be quarried, cut, and moved into position, although the process was made slightly easier by the fact that the stones were not uniform in size or smoothly finished. Instead, they were fitted together as well as they could be, and mortar was used to bind them thereafter. Much of the material involved was limestone, which was cut out of quarries near the Giza plateau itself. However, some of the stone was brought vast distances to Giza. 8,000 tons of granite, for instance, was used in certain sections of the pyramid, and this type of rock was not available near Giza or the capital Men Nefer nearby. Thus, 8,000 tons of granite blocks were quarried at Aswan, way up the River Nile in what is now southern Egypt, and transported north over 850 kilometers to Giza. The stones involved were then assembled into 216 different layers of blocks, averaging 2/3 of a meter in height each. Given the enormous amount of blocks involved, the sheer weight of the construction materials, and the labor needed to build this colossal monument, how was such a construction project achieved? And who performed the building process itself? This is a question that has fascinated Egyptologists and anyone with an interest in ancient Egypt for centuries. Because of the sheer manpower involved and the apparent drudgery of the labor, a common misconception which emerged centuries ago and which still holds some sway today is that the pyramids were built by a small army of slaves. While an understandable conclusion to reach, the archaeological evidence, which includes a workers' village uncovered in the Giza area to the southeast of the Great Pyramid itself back in the late 1980s, points towards the builders of the pyramids being paid laborers who actually lived reasonably well, with the average worker eating considerably better than others in Egyptian society at the time. Their protein intake was certainly higher. As to how many laborers were involved, it is hard to tell, as seasonal workers may have been drafted in at certain times. Diodorus Siculus argued that 360,000 workers were involved. Herodotus claimed that 100,000 were employed in shifts of 3 months at a time. While these are guesses made 2 millennia after Khufu's own time, there is no doubt that the pharaoh was footing the bill for at least tens of thousands of workers to erect his pyramid. It is the only way that a monument this size could have been built, given the technology available at the time. In recent decades, more scientific approaches to determining the size of the workforce involved have been utilized, specifically by actually having people use the tools that were available at the time and trying to cut out the sort of 2.5-ton limestone blocks that make up the majority of the Great Pyramid. This approach was aided enormously by the discovery back in the mid-2010s of a complete quarried block and some ancient tools in a limestone quarry dating to Khufu's reign. Using precise replicas of these tools, a team determined that it would take 4 workers 3 8-hour days to quarry and carve out one of these 2.5-ton blocks. However, if they employed water to wet the stone, the process could be accelerated significantly, though it is doubtful that the kind of water necessary to do so could have been made available. All in all, the team determined that a labor force of 3,500 workers on site at this quarry would have been able to produce 250 blocks every day. Double this number to 7,000 workers producing 500 blocks per day, and it would have taken about 13 years to produce all the blocks needed for the Great Pyramid. This is an entirely feasible analysis, though clearly, if you had 7,000 men working on quarrying and stone cutting alone, this would only constitute a proportion of the entire workforce, as others would be needed to transport the stones from the quarries to Giza and to work at the pyramid site itself, while others still would be working in an ancillary capacity producing tools, transporting food and water for the workers, and so on and so forth. A study which has just appeared in 2024 has added a further piece of evidence to explain how the pyramids were built on the Giza plateau. This revealed that a 64-kilometer branch of the River Nile, known as the Aramat Nile branch, which dried up several thousand years ago and was buried under farmland, once flowed from the main River Nile to Giza, allowing workers to transport the blocks by river to close to the building site. It was an enormous operation no matter how you look at it, but achievable. Incredibly, a diary of sorts kept by an overseer of some of the workmen, a man named Mera, has survived. Mera was a mid-ranking official who was responsible for a team of workmen operating at the Tura quarries, where limestone blocks were being quarried and cut to the southeast of Giza. His diary itemizes the cutting of blocks and the teams involved in working on the pyramid, or what was described by Mera as Akhet Khufu, meaning the horizon of Khufu. Further details outline the transportation of the blocks by boat and the cost of food and other materials. Not all of the diary of Mera, which was found buried near a cave at the Wadi al-Jarf on the Red Sea coast of Egypt in 2013, and which is written in hieroglyphs constituting the oldest papyrus text to have survived in the world, have been deciphered. Yet, and it might reveal more about the construction of the Great Pyramid in due course. Some of the issues concerning the construction of the pyramids have been a source of unending debate, notably where the stones came from and how they were lifted into place. Diodorus commented on this in his Bibliotheca. He noted that many people were of the view that the stones that were used to build the pyramid had been dragged all the way from Arabia, while they had been lifted into place using enormous ramps, as cranes of any kind which might be able to lift such enormous blocks had not yet been invented. We know that for the most part, the stones involved were actually quarried in the wider Giza region and were not brought from afar, although the granite blocks used were transported considerable distances. The issue of how the blocks were raised is much more contentious. Many scholars contend that a ramp of some kind was used, along which the laborers dragged the stones at an elevation. However, in order for it to be possible to drag stones that weighed 2.5 tons, particularly to the higher sections of the pyramid, the ramp would have had to have been around a mile long and would have been larger in size than the pyramid itself. Furthermore, space is limited on the Giza plateau, a necropolis with a fairly sheer cliff face. As such, it would have been difficult to build such a ramp here. Egyptologists still cannot agree on how the Great Pyramid was actually constructed, with new theories emerging in recent decades to suggest water power was employed to move the stones. One of the more interesting accounts of the building of the pyramids comes from Herodotus. He claimed that Khufu first had great roads constructed all the way from Arabia to Egypt, and then the quarried rock was brought overland, with some transported by sea. He further claimed that the work was seasonal, with 100,000 men working at any given time in rotating shifts of 3 months, a system which suggests a perception that these were not slaves. The Greek historian claimed the road alone took 10 years to build and describes it in such a way as to suggest that the remains of the road were still visible in his time, 2 millennia after Khufu's reign. Turning to the Great Pyramid itself, Herodotus was knowledgeable enough to know that there were underground chambers in it. His belief was that the pyramid took 20 years to build, and that the stone slabs were lifted up from tier to tier using giant wooden logs, which he referred to as levers. Finally, in Herodotus's time, there were still hieroglyphics on the outside, which spoke about the range of foodstuffs that were necessary to feed the workmen, with an Egyptian interpreter telling Herodotus that 1,600 talents of silver had been spent on feeding the workers alone. An Attic talent at Herodotus's time of writing weighed just over 25 kiloudals, so this would suggest that 40 tons of silver were needed to buy all the food which fed the workmen who built the Great Pyramid before other construction costs were ever taken into account. The most striking element of all of this is that any of it happened at all, given the sheer amount of labor involved and the secondary labor needed to supply the workers with food, tools, and other resources. A substantial proportion of Egyptian society was effectively co-opted into building an enormous tomb for one man. The explanation for this is that many Egyptians by the 4th dynasty were used to viewing kings like Khufu as semi-divine beings. The Egyptian religious system was already geared around identifying members of the royal family as earthly manifestations of the gods, hence Khufu's broader name, Khnum Khufu. It was this idealization of the pharaohs as being the gods in human form that allowed a society like Old Kingdom Egypt to dedicate the resources necessary to construct such an enormous monument. In doing so, the idea of the kings as celestial beings became self-fulfilling. Imagine the impression it must have made on individuals in the mid-3rd millennium BC when they traveled to the capital Mennefer and saw Khufu's enormous pyramid tomb towering over the River Nile on top of the Giza plateau. It is still an awe-inspiring spectacle today, in an age of skyscrapers and space travel. To a person over 4.5 millennia ago, it would have reinforced the perception of the king as a divine being. This view was attested to in antiquity, with Diodorus noting of the blocks used that they, quote, do not have the appearance of being the slow handiwork of men, but look like a sudden creation, as though they had been made by some god and set down bodily in the surrounding sand. Khufu did not simply order the construction of an enormous pyramid of blocks on top of the Giza plateau. There is a highly complex series of shafts, chambers, and tunnels inside the Great Pyramid. These are accessed through an entrance that was left in the exterior, roughly 17 meters above the base of the pyramid. This then leads off into other passageways and chambers some of which are extremely narrow, and the exact purpose or symbolism of which are still intensely debated. One is the subterranean chamber, which was actually cut down into the bedrock below the pyramid, so that it now is over 25 meters below the base of the Great Pyramid. It is an extensive chamber, measuring over 8 meters by 14 meters, with a large pit. What the purpose of it was meant to be is unclear, though one theory is that Khufu had originally intended for this to be his burial chamber, but later changed his mind and ordered the incorporation of a chamber for his sarcophagus and grave goods much higher up within the pyramid proper. Another room much further up is the Queen's Chamber, a somewhat misleading title, as it is not at all clear if it was intended that one of Khufu's wives would be interred here. One of the more mysterious elements of the Queen's Chamber is a series of very small shafts running out from it, ones which cannot be entered or explored by humans, and which have only begun to reveal their secrets as a result of the use of modern technology in recent years. The most widely discussed part of the interior of the Great Pyramid is the King's Chamber and the passages and rooms surrounding it. This was a room measuring roughly 10.5 meters by 5 meters, with a flat ceiling 6 meters high. It is found roughly a third of the way up the pyramid, the base of the King's Chamber lying around 46 meters above the base of the pyramid itself. The construction of the chamber is fascinating. The roof is made out of 9 enormous granite blocks, which were brought all the way from Aswan in southern Egypt, and which weigh between 25 and 80 tons. The process of trying to get 80-ton blocks, some 60 meters up to near the midway point of the pyramid, and then lowering them down onto the roof of the King's Chamber was one of the engineering marvels of history. Unfortunately, though, the splendor of the King's Chamber is otherwise lost to us. Despite the inclusion of an antechamber which was designed to fend off would-be robbers, when the King's Chamber was reopened in modern times, everything except a granite sarcophagus that would have once housed Khufu's remains had long since been pilfered by thieves, and the sarcophagus itself was broken. The riches of this chamber in antiquity must have been immense, when we consider that Khufu was a great ruler at the height of the Old Kingdom, whereas the only intact pharaonic tomb that has ever been found, that of the New Kingdom ruler Tutankhamun, contained immense wealth in the burial chamber of a relatively minor king. From the King's Chamber, there are further chambers and passages. These include the star shafts, 2 narrow ducts which run all the way from the King's Chamber to the exterior of the Great Pyramid. They run upwards at angles and point into the sky and the stars at night. The purpose of them is contentious. One theory suggests that the south shaft may have pointed towards the star constellation Orion's Belt in ancient times. Other Egyptologists have proposed more pedestrian explanations, claiming that these were just air ventilation shafts used so that workers could breathe while working on the chambers during the construction period. However, there are no such star shafts on any other Old Kingdom pyramids, and so this theory seems unlikely. The most plausible explanation is that the shafts, of which 2 more flow outwards from the Queen's Chamber, were designed to point towards stars and constellations, which Khufu and the Old Kingdom Egyptians considered to be particularly important in their cosmology, notably Orion's Belt, Sirius, or the Dog Star, and Alpha Draconis, the latter of which would have been close to the North Celestial Pole in the middle of the 3rd millennium BC. A visitor to Giza today is presented with a sight that is quite different from what Khufu would have beheld when he arrived on the plateau to view his pyramid when work was completed in the 26th century BC. Today, one sees the layers of limestone blocks exposed and a rather flat top to the pyramid, but the original finish was much different. For starters, the entire outside of the pyramid was encased in white limestone, which was then finished by workmen to give the entire pyramid a smooth, polished finish. At the very peak, there would have stood a pyramidion, a capstone that gave the whole pyramid a pointed top, and which would have made an impressive finish to it, one that glittered in the warm Sahara sun. This pyramidion, contrary to popular belief, would not have been made of gold or electrum, a naturally occurring alloy of gold and silver, nor was it gilded by putting gold casing around the outside of the pyramidion. In later times, some pyramidions were produced in Egypt which were gilded, but in the 4th dynasty, the pyramidions were generally made from smooth limestone or some other well-worked and polished stone. We know this because while the pyramidion from Khufu's Great Pyramid has long since been lost, several others from 4th dynasty pyramids are extant, and they were not made of gold. When the pyramidion from Khufu's Great Pyramid was lost is unclear, but Pliny the Elder, the Roman encyclopedist of the 1st century AD, noted that it was gone by his time. The limestone casing collapsed off of the Great Pyramid owing to natural disasters such as the 1303 Great Earthquake of Crete and was carried away and reused to build mosques and other buildings in Cairo over the centuries. Estimates vary as to how long it took for the Great Pyramid to be constructed, but a conservative estimate is around 20 years, though others suggest that the incomplete nature of some of the inner chambers suggests that it was still not fully complete when Khufu died sometime in or around 2565 BC. We can assume that he was buried in great splendor with a mass of gold and jeweled funerary goods, while after elaborate religious ceremonies, his mummified body was placed in the sarcophagus in the king's chamber. However, everything, including his mummy, was pilfered at some point in antiquity or during the medieval era. Another tradition holds that Khufu was not interred at all in the Great Pyramid, which he had employed such great resources on the construction of. Diodorus Siculus stated that Khufu was so loathed at the end of his reign for his tyrannous rule that he enjoined his family to bury him instead in an unmarked grave, as the people in their anger would enter his tomb and defile his mummy if he was laid to rest in the Great Pyramid. This is highly implausible, given that the passages and entry points would have been sealed up after the interment of a pharaoh within them, and it was only by burrowing a large tunnel, now referred to as the Robber's Tunnel, that people in centuries gone by were able to enter the king's chamber and pilfer it. Khufu seems to have been succeeded by his son Gedefre, though it is also possible that he only co-ruled with his father for a time and died before Khufu himself. Regardless of whether he ruled on his own briefly after his father died, the various king lists which have survived agree that Gedefre's rule was brief, and he was eventually succeeded by another of Khufu's sons, Khafre. Khafre ruled for a long time, like his father, and he also emulated Khufu in erecting a great pyramid on the Giza plateau. His is the second largest of the 3 great pyramids, standing just in the shadow of his father's tomb, while the consensus today amongst Egyptologists is that Khafre was responsible for erecting the Sphinx here as well, with the head of the half-man, half-lion statue being an image of Khufu's son. A son of Khafre's, Menkaure, would later add the third and last of the 3 great pyramids there. The other, smaller pyramids are those of Egyptian queens, while further excavation work in modern times has revealed that there were hundreds of other stone and brick mastaba tombs built at Giza to house the remains of the extended royal families of the Old Kingdom and senior priests and government officials. Not long after Menkaure's death around 2500 BC, the 4th dynasty came to an end, perhaps following the death of a son, Shepseskaf, who ruled as pharaoh down to around 2496 BC. The 5th dynasty followed thereafter as a new imperial family rose to rule in Egypt. The 4th dynasty is generally deemed to have been the peak of Old Kingdom Egypt, although the Old Kingdom continued down to beyond 2200 BC, when civil war split Upper and Lower Egypt, leading to a century-and-a-half long era of decline known as the First Intermediate Period. The Great Pyramid of Khufu captured the imagination of writers and travelers, even in ancient times, as the discussion of it by figures like Manetho, Herodotus, and Diodorus Siculus indicates. There were many other writers who discussed it, though without mentioning anything about its alleged builder. For instance, Pliny the Elder, a Roman encyclopedist of the 1st century AD, in his Historia Naturalis, remarked on the internal passages and how he believed there was a well inside the pyramid which reached down far enough to access the water table of the River Nile. He also stated that Thales, one of the great early Greek philosophers and scientists who hailed from the city of Miletus in Asia Minor in the 6th century BC, had traveled to Egypt and had carried out mathematical observations there using the shadows cast by the sun on the pyramid, almost as though it were a giant sundial. Before Pliny's time, the Greek poet Antipater of Sidon, writing in the early 1st century BC, included the Great Pyramid in his list of the 7 wonders of the world. The 7 wonders are generally derived from Antipater's list, and it included the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, the statue of Zeus, and the others that we are familiar with. All of the other 6 wonders of the world were destroyed at various times in antiquity or thereafter. The exception was the Great Pyramid. Part of the reason why it was so undisturbed was that there were few major wars in Egypt itself in antiquity, and there was an incredible continuity of culture in the land of the Nile between Khufu's time down to the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty and the beginning of Roman rule here in the 1st century BC. As such, the people and priests here revered the old tombs, pyramids, and temples century after century and protected them. This situation changed with the advent of Arab rule in the 7th century, as the followers of Muhammad burst out of Arabia and conquered the Middle East and North Africa. One of the rulers of the Arab Caliphate, Al-Mamun, is understood to have ordered his followers to blow a hole in the side of Khufu's pyramid and to tunnel into it in the early 9th century. At least Al-Mamun was simply inquisitive. Much more nefarious were the actions of the governor of Egypt in the late 12th century, Al-Aziz Uthman, a son of the Muslim warlord Saladin. Uthman decided that he would destroy the pyramids in a fit of iconoclastic religiosity aimed at getting rid of these false idols. Fortunately, his engineers failed to do so and only succeeded in damaging the Pyramid of Menkaure, the smallest of the 3 pyramids on the Giza plateau. In more recent times, natural disasters have been more troublesome. In 1303, the Great Earthquake caused such devastation that it cracked and knocked off a large amount of the marble casing around the pyramid, an event which incidentally did much to destroy one of the other remaining wonders of the world as well, the Lighthouse of Alexandria. Despite a common misperception that they badly damaged the pyramids and the Sphinx on the Giza plateau during their expedition to the country under Napoleon Bonaparte at the end of the 18th century, there is no concrete evidence to suggest the French damaged anything at the Giza complex. What they did do was initiate the modern discipline of Egyptology, which over time has led to preservation work being undertaken extensively at Giza. Unfortunately, though, the site is still susceptible to natural disasters and another earthquake. In 1992, the epicenter of which was in the suburbs of Cairo, damaged the Great Pyramid, causing it to shrink by several feet as blocks caved in internally. Given the level of interest in Khufu's tomb over the 4.5 millennia since it was built, one would think that it had revealed all of its secrets long ago. But this certainly isn't the case. The Great Pyramid was built in such a way that passages and shafts were covered up by subsequent layers and made inaccessible for humans. As such, parts of it simply cannot be accessed unless one were to systematically dismantle the pyramid. Therefore, Egyptologists are still working today to try to uncover all of its secrets and to determine what the purpose of the shafts and tunnels inside it were and how the whole thing was built. New scientific methods, for instance, by using small robots and cameras to investigate parts of the pyramid which simply cannot be accessed by humans, are being employed all the time and are throwing up new discoveries. As recently as March 2023, a new 30-foot long corridor was revealed using infrared thermography and other technologies. Khufu's mysterious tomb continues to fascinate in the early 3rd millennium AD. As the foregoing has outlined, there is far more about the pharaoh Khufu that we don't know than what we do know. From the king lists and other ancient sources, it is clear that he ruled Egypt as part of the 4th dynasty, around 2600 BC. There is also no disputing that he was responsible for building the greatest of the pyramids on the Giza plateau as his tomb. But beyond this, very little else can be said about him with certainty. He was evidently one of the strongest rulers of Old Kingdom Egypt, expanding the kingdom's control further into the Sinai Peninsula and towards the Red Sea. Other issues are more speculative. Perhaps he was a ruler who had little respect for the gods and who tyrannized his people into building him his great tomb, much as later Greek writers claimed. However, it is just as plausible that these are elaborate myths that developed in the centuries between Khufu's time and that of Herodotus and others. Then again, perhaps it is just as fitting that we know so little about Khufu, the mystery of his life correlating with the many mysteries of the pyramid which he had built and which still towers over Cairo today, a testament to the dawn of civilization on the banks of the River Nile. What do you think of Pharaoh Khufu? How is it possible that during his reign, a society that had only so recently emerged as a Bronze Age culture could start to build an enormous monument such as the Great Pyramid of Giza? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. The pharaoh known by history as Pharaoh Akhenaten entered this world at an uncertain date and year, though almost certainly during the 1360s BC. He was definitely alive by 1361 BC, but most probably many years before this, with 1368 BC or 1367 BC being reasonable candidates for his year of birth. His father was the pharaoh or ruler of Egypt, Amenhotep III. Akhenaten received his father's name at birth, and while history knows him as Akhenaten, for much of his existence he was called Amenhotep. Akhenaten, as we shall discover, was a designation he adopted later in his life. Amenhotep III had occupied the throne for approximately 2 decades by the time Akhenaten was born, having become pharaoh in the early 1380s BC. The location of Akhenaten's birth remains unknown. Some Egyptologists have theorized that he may have been born and raised in the ancient city of Memphis near Heliopolis, a city which maintained a strong tradition of worshipping the sun god Ra. Others argue that he was born around the city of Thebes, the more southern capital of the Egyptian kingdom in the 14th century BC, equivalent to modern-day Luxor. There, a major royal palace had been constructed at Malkata by his father, and it would likely make most sense for him to have been born there. Akhenaten's mother was Tiye, the principal wife of Amenhotep. Egyptian monarchs practiced polygamy and maintained numerous wives, some often being close relatives or even sisters. Among these multiple consorts, there was typically a principal wife, and the pharaoh's heir would normally be selected from among the sons born to this chief consort. This positioned Akhenaten in line for the throne, but he had an elder brother who was also born to Tiye, Prince Thutmose. Beyond these, Akhenaten had a vast number of siblings and half-siblings due to the polygamous nature of the royal court. The boy who would become Akhenaten one day was born into a region of the world which already possessed a very extensive history. By the 14th century BC, Egypt had emerged as far back as the 4th millennium BC as one of the first major centers of Neolithic and Chalcolithic settled civilizations as people began farming in great numbers along the shores of the River Nile. In ancient times, and indeed prior to the construction of the Aswan Dam in the 20th century, the Nile flooded annually. This yearly inundation deposited rich alluvial soil onto the banks of the river several hundred meters inland, allowing people here to survive from the agricultural products grown on these floodplains in an otherwise arid desert environment. Based on this, an advanced culture with a writing system, industry, and other economic elements emerged. By the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, the pharaohs, or kings, of the Old Kingdom were in a position to deploy resources capable of building the Great Pyramid on the Giza Plateau next to modern-day Cairo. Unsurprisingly, a complex religious system also developed, one which venerated deities like Osiris, the god of the River Nile, on which the people were so reliant for their subsistence, and Ra, the sun god, who was so central to the lives of people who otherwise lived in the midst of the Sahara Desert. This pharaonic society had peaked early in the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, as the rulers of what is termed the Old Kingdom built the greatest of the pyramids. Thereafter, it went through peaks and valleys. For instance, the 22nd and 21st centuries BC were turbulent ones of unrest in Egypt, but thereafter the Middle Kingdom was a new period of growth. A fresh bout of chaos came in the 17th century BC, when a people called the Hyksos descended from the Levant into northern Egypt, conquered the Nile Delta, and much of the north of the country from the Egyptian kings. For a period of a century and a half, Egypt was divided and harassed by the Hyksos, yet they too were conquered over time, and in the 15th century BC, Akhenaten's great-great-grandfather, Thutmose III, had overseen Egypt's rise to a position of unprecedented national power and wealth. Ruling for over half a century, he reunified Egypt fully, extended its power further down the Nile into what we now call Sudan, and also conquered much of the Levant into regions approximating today's Palestine, Israel, and even towards Jordan and into parts of Syria and Lebanon. Trade flourished across the eastern Mediterranean, and an ambitious building program was initiated. This period of immense Egyptian power of which Thutmose was the greatest ruler, is called the New Kingdom period of Egyptian history. Akhenaten would benefit from succeeding to the throne, as Egypt was in such a favorable position of power, but his reign would also stand as a period of turmoil within it. As the shadowy details of his birth would indicate, there is almost nothing known about Akhenaten's early life. However, such is the interest in the reign of one of the most unusual and significant of ancient Egypt's rulers that many theories have emerged over the years. One holds that he was raised to a significant extent away from the royal capital at Memphis in the north, near where Cairo stands today. Here, it is suggested that he was a high priest of the god Ptah, the god of workers and industry in the Egyptian religious system. We know that his older brother, Prince Thutmose, served as high priest of Ptah as well for several years before he headed south to begin training as his father's successor at Thebes. The suggestion is that Akhenaten succeeded him in that role afterwards, and it may have been this time in his youth as a high priest that imbued Akhenaten with strong religious sensibilities. Other theories concern his education, with several well-known scribes of the time being suggested as possible tutors of the prince. We can be certain that one of these, a man named Parennefer, did indeed tutor young Akhenaten in his childhood years, as this Parennefer was later honored with a major tomb where an inscription notes his role in educating the pharaoh. Parennefer would also go on to become the senior-most minister in Akhenaten's government in later years, and seems to have been a major influence on Akhenaten's life and reign. Some greater clarity is possible when it comes to Akhenaten's wives and children, though there is still a lot that remains speculative even in this area. One thing is for sure, his principal wife, or chief wife, was a woman by the name of Nefertiti. They married at some stage in the 1350s, and so she and he were most likely wed when they were little more than teenagers. They may have been closely related, with some Egyptologists claiming she was a first cousin of Akhenaten's, or some other near relation within the Egyptian royal line. She was quite possibly a few years older than him. Nefertiti is one of the most famous royal women in the entirety of Egyptian history. This is based on multiple developments, the first being her position as chief wife to Akhenaten, who would become one of the most notorious of all ancient Egypt's pharaohs. Secondly, she is famous for a remarkable bust or statue of her head and neck that has survived over 3 millennia. This painted limestone bust was created around 1345 BC by a famous royal sculptor of the time by the name of Thutmose, discovered in 1912 during archaeological work at the city of Amarna. It presents one of the most vivid portraits of any Bronze Age woman to have come down to us. Finally, Nefertiti is well known for most likely being the mother of Tutankhamun, a pharaoh whose gold death mask, discovered by Howard Carter back in 1922, has become a defining symbol of ancient Egypt. Beyond this, she is also a good example of a royal consort who appears to have held a position of extensive political power in New Kingdom Egypt. Akhenaten had several other wives beyond Nefertiti. One was Kia, a name which is believed to have been a shortened version of Tadokipa. If so, she most likely was a princess of the Mitanni royal family, a people who ruled an area around Kurdistan, today, where the borders of Turkey, Syria, and Iraq meet. Accordingly, her marriage to Akhenaten would have been political to cement diplomatic relations between Egypt and a near neighbor. Other scholars of Akhenaten's reign argue that Kia and Tadokipa were two different wives. Kia was nevertheless most likely of foreign blood, as she is described in some inscriptions as being Akhenaten's beloved wife, one who evidently could not rise to the position of principal wife, as she, unlike Nefertiti, was not of Egyptian blood. Akhenaten also possibly married a daughter of the ruler of Babylon in Mesopotamia, though her name is unknown, while there is speculation that he was married to an unidentified sister of his. From amongst these marriages, Akhenaten had many children. His marriage to Nefertiti resulted in 7 or more children, most of them daughters. There were numerous other children from his other unions, though the exact details of these cannot be reconstructed from the available evidence, and there would doubtlessly have been some who died in infancy as well, for which no record of their existence has survived. Akhenaten's earlier years were lived in the knowledge that his older brother, Prince Thutmose, was their father's designated successor, and so he would succeed as pharaoh upon Amenhotep III's death. But Thutmose died sometime in the early to mid-1350s, With this, Akhenaten became the new heir, and so from the mid-1350s, by which time he was most likely only just entering his teenage years, he began to co-rule with his father, an arrangement which was usually established to train a successor in the key elements of government and the religious obligations of the pharaoh. There would also have been a growing awareness of the fact that Amenhotep perhaps did not have long left to live. Statues and other visible depictions of the pharaoh dating to the 1350s depict a ruler who looks to have been aged and sick, while DNA evidence from his mummy indicates he may have been suffering from obesity and arthritis, though he was still only in his 40s. Incidentally, contrary to some popular views that the Egyptians had very effective forms of dental care, Amenhotep was also suffering by the time Akhenaten became co-ruler from teeth that were plagued with cavities and which would have caused him serious pain. It was this obese, arthritic, and pain-ridden figure who managed to rule down to around 1351 BC, though perhaps as late as 1349 BC. Upon his death, Akhenaten ascended as pharaoh in his own right, initially with the regnal name Amenhotep IV, though he would soon change it to Akhenaten. The first years of Akhenaten's personal rule were distinct from what followed. The 4 or 5 years in question down to 1346 BC have been termed the Karnak years by some Egyptologists to indicate that he was still continuing to rule in a regular fashion from the seat of government near the Temple of Karnak in the capital, at Thebes on the course of the River Nile in central Egypt. He was most likely crowned here, though possibly at Memphis, the ancient capital of the Old Kingdom. There are also inscriptions and other documentary and material evidence from the early 1340s, which point towards Akhenaten continuing to worship multiple ancient Egyptian gods, such as Ra, Amun, Ptah, Hathor, and Nekhbet, while textual inscriptions also refer to the gods in plural. He also continued to develop the city of Thebes, a metropolis which was at the heart of a rich and energetic kingdom. The Late Bronze Age was a period of immense vitality and wealth of a kind which would not be seen again until the Greek culture of the 6th and 5th centuries BC. Thebes was at the very heart of this, a bustling city where industries like stone cutting, painting, glassmaking, pottery making, and other crafts, as well as professional schools for scribes, medics, and other skilled workers flourished. Furthermore, with a possible population of between 80,000 and 100,000, there is a chance Thebes was the largest city in the world at that time. Life here in the first few years of Akhenaten's reign would have appeared perfectly normal. Few could have predicted what a strange turn things were about to take. Another feature of these Karnak years was Akhenaten's completion of some of the building projects which his father had initiated during his long reign of some 4 decades. This focused on the mortuary site which Amenhotep had developed at Kom-el-Hetan, across the River Nile from the city of Thebes. The majority of the mortuary temple here has been destroyed over the centuries, but the layout of it can be reconstructed. It would have consisted of rows of pylons, indoor sanctums, and outdoor sun courts, so that there was an interplay of light and dark along the walkways. This was a standard practice of ancient Egyptian religious buildings, and if rituals were held here at specific times of the day, the shafts of light penetrating through specific parts of the building would have made a deep impression on participants. In rituals here, particularly where gold objects were used to refract the sun's rays in different ways, it all points to the way the sun was already central to the Egyptian religious system and provides a backdrop to the religious changes Akhenaten was about to undertake. Elsewhere in the building, 2 gigantic statues were erected. Known today as the Colossi of Memnon, these 60-foot-high stone monuments loomed over the western bank of the River Nile and could not have failed to impress people voyaging up and down the river on boats. The building work on the temple and the carving of the Colossi was only completed around 1350 BC, most likely just after Akhenaten had become pharaoh in his own right, and he would have overseen the rituals which no doubt accompanied the consecration of the new temple structure. The first years of Akhenaten's reign were normative in other respects. He continued to add to the great temple within the city precinct on the right bank of the Nile in Thebes. Here, there is even an inscription depicting the new pharaoh making offerings to the god Ra, though elsewhere there was a subtle profusion of shrines and other religious spaces dedicated to the sun god Aten in the early 1340s. In Thebes, Akhenaten, oversaw a Sed festival in the second or third year of his reign. This was, in itself, a rather peculiar move on his part. Sed festivals were the ancient Egyptian equivalent of a royal jubilee. They were typically only held after 20 or 30 years of the same pharaoh being ruler of the kingdom, and then every 3 or 4 years thereafter. In calling one within a few years of his accession, Akhenaten was indicating his willingness to break with tradition. His motive in doing so may have been a desire to establish continuity between his own reign and that of his father, and it is noted that the date of it may have fallen around the 40th anniversary of Amenhotep III's accession. If this is so, perhaps Akhenaten felt some vulnerability about having been a younger son, and only emerging as the heir and then pharaoh in the course of the 1350s. The Sed festival may have been organized in an effort to proclaim the legitimacy of his reign and cement his status as the new pharaoh. While there were normative elements to Akhenaten's reign during its first years, it would soon take a dramatic turn that has created an infamous position for the pharaoh within the history of ancient Egypt. The shift came in 1346 BC, though for how long Akhenaten had been considering this new course, or why he decided upon it at this time, remains a mystery with no clear answer. This all centered on the deity Aten, also spelled Aton, Atonu, or Iten, in various other references to him on temple inscriptions. The word itself derives from Old Kingdom Egyptian and refers effectively to a disk or sun disk. Therefore, in its earliest incarnation, the name Aten was used simply as a noun to refer to the spherical or disk-like appearance of the sun when viewed in the sky. Over time, the term Aten became one which was used to refer to a sun deity or god. Aten was just one such sun god. The most popular and important of these was Ra, one of the most significant of all the Egyptian gods and goddesses, who was said to travel through the sky in an arc every day, bringing light to the world, while in the evening he retired and night fell. Aten was just one of over a dozen deities that emerged around the worship of the sun, day and night in Egypt over the centuries. These practices of multiple forms of sun deity were reflected in a great many other ancient cultures of the Chalcolithic, Bronze, and Iron Ages. What is unusual about Akhenaten's actions is the fact that Aten was still a relatively minor deity. By the 14th century BC, although there is evidence that the importance of sun deity was growing in the Bronze Age world of the Eastern Mediterranean around this time, Akhenaten now went one major step further. For reasons which remain elusive, he decided to proclaim the worship of Aten as a form of state religion. In this new religious system, the personification of the sun as a disk became central, stripped of many of the complex mythological elements which pertain to the worship of the sun through Ra and other more well-known sun gods. Although much of the material record of the worship of Aten was subsequently destroyed and wiped out by his successors, it is clear that temples were built or rededicated to the new god by Akhenaten, and inscriptions were set up on altars and worshipping sites to the new deity. The pharaoh even changed his name. It is from around this time, at the end of the 1350s BC, that he began being referred to as Akhenaten or Akhenaton, meaning something akin to effective for Aten, or one who is devoted to Aten. The latter decision was not entirely unusual. Egyptian rulers and nobles were often named after different deities. Rameses, the name borne by many of Akhenaten's successors, includes the name of the sun god Ra. Thutmose III, Akhenaten's great forebear of the 15th century BC, was named after Thoth, the god of wisdom and magic. The traditional nature of naming oneself after a god aside, the move towards active worship of just one deity was quite unusual for the time, one which effectively leaned towards a form of monotheism, though as we will see soon, there is a major debate amongst Egyptologists about the nature of the new religion. Before turning to the specifics of the new religion and how Akhenaten sought to expand it, it is worth trying to reconstruct the philosophical basis for it, a task which is made difficult by efforts to destroy the memory of Akhenaten's new religion by his successors. Firstly, the worship of Aten was perhaps derived in large part from outside influences. Whether from the Levant, the wider Middle East, or further afield, there are Semitic aspects to it. In this sense, Akhenaten's decision to adopt it as the state religion points towards the growing prosperity and cosmopolitan nature of the late Bronze Age world, one in which ideas trafficked between cultures over hundreds of kilometers. Secondly, it was something of a more personal religion insofar as it involved a more direct communication between the individual worshipper and the sun deity, whereas Egyptian religion in the main used intermediaries, priests who received the offerings of lay people and then offered them to the gods for them. One of the reasons why Akhenaten's innovations were possibly so violently reacted against after his death was that he was alleged to have attacked the privileges of the powerful priestly classes. These were some of the core traits of the new religion, and we see inscriptions from the time and images which show people making offerings directly to Aten, without priests and temple officials involved. There is, as we have already noted, a wide-ranging debate amongst Egyptologists and historians of Akhenaten's reign over how we should classify this new system. The traditional view, back when the details of what Akhenaten had attempted, and as modern Egyptology developed as a discipline in the early and mid-20th century, was that it was effectively a form of monotheism. This is the idea that one god should be worshipped exclusively. Christianity, Islam, and several other modern religious systems are monotheistic. By way of contrast, ancient Egypt, and indeed most other ancient religious systems, such as those of Babylon, Greece, and Rome, were all polytheistic. That is, they worshipped multiple gods, or a pantheon of sometimes hundreds of gods and goddesses. While it is tempting to see the brief experiment in the worship of Aten as a form of monotheism, it seems more plausible to describe it as a form of monolatry. This is where the existence of a wide pantheon of deities is still accepted, but one is now placed in a position of singular importance. The idea here is that Akhenaten was not trying to disavow the existence of the other gods and goddesses, but that he was proclaiming to his people that Aten should be worshipped above all others. There was also a form of syncretism involved, the borrowing of other cultural practices and incorporation of them within one's own system. The belief is that Akhenaten proposed affording Aten a position of singular importance within Egyptian religious life, influenced by outside ideas from the Middle East and the Mediterranean world about the importance of sun deities. Some have argued that this cult of a powerful sun deity might have origins in the religious systems of the Semitic people of the Levant and Middle East, and that Akhenaten was influenced by ideas which entered Egypt from this region as the new kingdom expanded there during the reign of Thutmose III and his successors. One of the other core components of the new religion was to proselytize or spread it by acquiring large numbers of adherents. This is an issue which has concerned Egyptologists greatly, as they wonder if Akhenaten simply established a new cult and hoped it would acquire followers over time, or if he aggressively attacked the cults of the other gods. The picture presented, from the evidence of inscriptions and other material which has been recovered, is complex. It is suggested that initially, in the late 1350s and early 1340s BC, he began to introduce a new cult of Aten alongside the other gods, but that over time, this was expanded to favor the new cult of Aten when it came to royal patronage. Then, towards the end of the reign, there might have been a watershed moment at which he became much more aggressive and actually began trying to actively undermine the cults and temples of prominent deities like Ra, Baal, Amun, Thoth, Seth, Mut, and others. In particular, there was an active campaign of attacking worship of the god Amun, who had become, along with Ra, the most preeminent deity within the Egyptian pantheon by the 14th century BC, and who had an especially strong cult following in Thebes. As such, Akhenaten does seem to have actively tried to undermine the worship of other deities, but the degree to which he did so, and whether or not it was evenly distributed amongst all the other gods and goddesses, is a matter of debate. Another key aspect of Akhenaten's religious revolution was the establishment of a new capital dedicated to the worship of Aten. It isn't surprising to learn that ancient Egypt had different capitals at different times when we consider the enormously long span of ancient Egyptian history, one which would eventually play out over more than 3 millennia. In its earliest days, the capital was located in Thinis, a city which we still don't even know the location of today. Around the 27th century BC, the capital was moved to Men-Nefer, or Memphis. This was located on the banks of the River Nile, just south of the delta and within the southern suburbs of modern-day Cairo. Not long afterwards, the pharaohs began building up the Great Pyramids at the Giza Plateau, not far away from this new capital. Memphis remained the center of power and governance down to the end of the Old Kingdom. The capital then moved around at various times, spending nearly 3 centuries during the Middle Kingdom period at Ichtawi, but increasingly became fixed during the New Kingdom period at Thebes, much further down the River Nile at the site of modern-day Luxor and near the Valley of the Kings. The reasons were twofold. On the one hand, a more southerly position allowed the pharaohs to govern their new territories to the south in Sudan or Nubia more effectively, while Thebes' position was solidified during the period when the north was ruled by the Hyksos. Thebes had become a flourishing economic, commercial, and religious center by the time the north was reconquered, and had remained the capital down to Akhenaten's time. He would briefly interrupt its primacy during his reign. Beginning around 1346 BC, Akhenaten initiated the construction of a new capital city, 100 kilometers north of Thebes on the right, or east, bank of the River Nile. Today, we know the site as Amarna, though in ancient times it was called Akhenaten, meaning the horizon of the Aten, a name which indicates the choosing of the location as a place where the rising sun coming east over Egypt could be seen with great clarity. This was compounded by the fact that the city was centered on an acropolis or hill, known to Egyptologists today as the Royal Wadi. The city was to be a dedicated governmental and religious center for the worship of Aten and was to function as the seat of the royal court. This was largely a virgin or greenfield site which had little settlement on it prior to the beginning of the project, beyond a small village that might have been in the vicinity. Tens of thousands of laborers would have been deployed here in order to speed the construction work along, and large sections of the Egyptian economy must have been turned over to providing building material and other goods in order to erect a city out of nothing, a not inconsiderable project given the resources available to ancient states. The city, which emerged in nearly complete form by 1341 BC, if the dedication inscriptions on some buildings here are accurate, was spread out along a 13-kilometer stretch of territory on the east bank of the River Nile. It was divided into a north and south city. The north city was centered on a royal palace and mortuary area, which were to be the heart of the government or administrative zone. The south city encompassed more of the village of the workers who erected the buildings, and would doubtlessly have become a more residential area once the buildings had been constructed, if the city had remained in use as a capital for longer than it ultimately did. To the east of this was the Acropolis and the tomb of Akhenaten, an elaborate mortuary building which it is assumed was intended for the pharaoh. Finally, between the north city and the workers' village, in the center of the development, there was the great temple of Aten. This elaborate temple complex of fine stones, statues, colonnaded arches, and other religious edifices was to be the heart of the worship of Aten in Akhenaten's realms, and was elaborately designed. Many reliefs and wall drawings have been recovered, which point to an extensive and refined level of building work here in the 1340s, replete with hundreds of altars for worshippers to make offerings to the god. The building work at Amarna and the art and architecture which began to emerge in Egypt, more generally in the decade between the inception of the cult of Aten in 1346 BC and the end of Akhenaten's reign in the mid-1330s BC, is very distinctive from other ancient Egyptian art. Indeed, so idiosyncratic is it that scholars talk of an Amarna style during the reign of Akhenaten. Statues become markedly different, with people depicted with much thinner and more austere faces with an almost feminine edge. These are distinct from the fuller and more regal-looking faces of nearly all other pharaohs. There was also a tendency to depict the royal family in a much more intimate way, with Akhenaten and Nefertiti presented together on wall reliefs and in statuary objects. Similarly, the headdresses and clothing worn are somewhat distinctive. Nefertiti's headgear in the famous bust of her is indicative of this, with Akhenaten's wife wearing a wig in a Nubian style. When it came to the temples and other religious spaces at Amarna, a marked difference was seen in the open nature of these sites. The high imposing walls punctuating sun courts which were typical of ancient Egyptian religious buildings, were abandoned in favor of temples with small enclosure walls. The courts where the religious ceremonies were carried out and offerings made were now out in the full view of the sun, so that worshippers could be in the presence of Aten entirely when attending his great temple at Amarna. Thus, Akhenaten's radical reforms extended beyond religion to how the royal government was depicted visually and presented itself to the people of Egypt. All of these decisions by Akhenaten have given rise to a major debate as to who he was on a personal level. This is almost impossible to determine when it comes to an ancient ruler. Kings and queens, 3,500 years ago, did not tend to write memoirs or anything of that kind that have survived and which might provide insight into who they were as individuals. Instead, we are left to reconstruct this from other evidence. Some have argued Akhenaten was a visionary and religious radical. Others have argued he could have been insane or mentally unhinged in some fashion. There really is no way of knowing, though. Another theory, which has the benefit of being grounded on a vision of him as a political power broker, was that he was fostering the cult of the sun deity as a means of aggrandizing himself. Courts in New Kingdom Egypt were no different from more modern courts and governments, with various factions and power groups, some trying to undermine the ruler. Perhaps Akhenaten decided, after years ruling from Thebes or Karnak, to begin the worship of Aten and establish a new capital as a radical break from the old political system. The new religion would weaken the powerful priestly class and their followers, and would centralize power in Akhenaten's hands, who, in adopting his new name, was intrinsically associating himself with the sun god. This view of him as a ruler trying to increase his own power by centralizing religious worship around him would also match with his decision to hold a said festival in Thebes not long after his accession, a move which, as we have seen, points towards some insecurity in his position as pharaoh. Ultimately, we can't be sure, but there are many things which might have motivated Akhenaten on a personal level. While Egyptologists and commentators on Akhenaten's reign have, for obvious reasons, commented primarily on the religious innovations he introduced, there were other things occurring in the 15 or so years between his adoption of Aten as the state god and his movement of the capital to Amarna. Most of this centered on foreign policy matters. While Egypt had risen to a position of unprecedented power and prosperity in the Bronze Age world during the reigns of Thutmose III and his successors, the kingdom did face opposition from various fronts. There were numerous other strong powers in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. Generally, Egypt maintained good relations and extensive trading ties to the Greek powers, such as the Minoans of Crete and the Mycenaeans of the mainland, the latter of which had largely subjugated Crete after a devastating natural disaster around 1500 BC. However, in the Middle East and Anatolia, it had rivals in the shape of the Hittite Empire and the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians were based out of Mesopotamia, or what we term Iraq today, and around this time were undergoing a major resurgence in their power under their ruler Ashur-uballit I. The Hittites were based out of Anatolia in modern-day Turkey and ruled southwards into the northern parts of Lebanon and Syria. During the late Bronze Age, they were a perennial rival of Egypt in this contested border zone. Beyond these, Akhenaten's government had to contend with raids out of the western deserts of Egypt, and also the perennial possibility of the Nubians, trying to free themselves from Egyptian domination down the River Nile into Sudan. We are fortunate, when it comes to Akhenaten's foreign policy, to have a major source of information of an unusual nature for a period in time 3.5 millennia ago. These are known as the Amarna letters. They are a series of 382 clay tablets which were discovered accidentally by some farmers in Amarna in the 1880s. They are unusual insofar as they are not written in Egyptian hieroglyphs, as one might expect, but rather in cuneiform writing, the type of script which was favored in the 3rd and 2nd millennia BC by people like the Sumerians, Babylonians, and Assyrians, who were based out of Mesopotamia. The tablets nearly all date to Akhenaten's reign and record his diplomatic agreements with the Assyrians and others, shedding some light on his foreign policy. There are also numerous letters between the pharaoh and local rulers of parts of the Levant, some of whom were ostensibly vassal subjects of Akhenaten in Canaan and other lands there in the mid-14th century BC. Interestingly, These vassal kings addressed Akhenaten as the sun, my lord, perhaps indicating an awareness of the new solar religion Akhenaten was promoting at home, whereas the kings of Assyria and other large states addressed the pharaoh as a brother and equal. The Amarna letters and other evidence offer an interesting insight into Akhenaten's foreign policy in the Levant and wider Middle East. When it comes to the Assyrians, Akhenaten was primarily caught up in a diplomatic dispute between them and the Babylonians, a declining power that still controlled land in southern Mesopotamia towards the Gulf of Persia. Despite the fact that the Assyrians had long since emerged from underneath the control of the Babylonians and were now the dominant power in the region, the Babylonian king Bernaburiash wrote to Akhenaten on 2 occasions inquiring as to why the Egyptian pharaoh was entertaining diplomatic envoys from Ashur-uballit of Assyria. He would have received short shrift from Akhenaten, who presumably was negotiating an accord with the Assyrians against the Hittites. The latter, under their ruler Suppiluliuma the Firm, did make raids into the Hittite-Egyptian border zone in Syria and Lebanon during the 1340s, though there was little of significance achieved by these. This perennial border conflict between the Hittites and Egyptians would continue for decades to come, peaking in the reign of Rameses II a century later, when one of the most significant engagements in ancient history, the Battle of Kadesh, was fought between the two. The Amarna letters are nevertheless a very useful window into how diplomacy worked here in the Bronze Age, particularly on the nature of the vassal city-states and principalities in the border zone, and how they communicated with the pharaohs in Egypt. A more significant military campaign was launched by Akhenaten to the south of his central kingdoms in Egypt. This occurred sometime in the middle of his reign, though the dating is not perfectly clear. Akhenaten did not lead the army himself, but dispatched his viceroy, the governor of much of Nubia, a man named Thutmose, to head southwards and quell a revolt amongst the perennially unruly Nubians. It was not unusual for a pharaoh to command an underling to lead such a military campaign when it came to Nubia. In any event, Thutmose treated the campaign as a routine military exercise, which such interventions largely were by that time, quickly bringing the unrest to an end. In the aftermath of it, several victory stelae or stone pillars were set up in parts of Egypt to commemorate the victory. Some Egyptologists have argued that there were other campaigns that Akhenaten might have engaged in, but all the evidence for these is very speculative. At the same time, we can probably dismiss the idea, which was favored a century ago, that Akhenaten was some sort of pacifist. The reality is that Egypt was in a strong position in the Levant when he ascended the throne, and the Hittites made little effort to reclaim lands in Syria and Lebanon during his reign, beyond a few border incursions and skirmishes. In such an environment, the pharaoh judiciously negotiated closer diplomatic ties with the Assyrians, kept his vassal rulers in the Levant pacified, and shored up Egyptian control over Nubia. This sensible foreign policy left him free to dedicate his time and the state's resources to his grand construction work and religious project in Amarna. In the end, Akhenaten's great enterprise was scuppered by ill health and mortality. In the 12th year of his rule, that is around 1340 BC, not long after the initial phase of building work had been completed at Amarna, and the new city was opened, so to speak, a major festival was held there to celebrate Akhenaten's 12th year on the throne. This saw emissaries, and perhaps even some rulers, arriving from neighboring countries and also from the vassal principalities and cities in the Levant to pay homage to the pharaoh. This was quite possibly the source of the plague which struck Egypt in the early 1330s BC. A deadly plague or disease outbreak of some kind definitely occurred, and it may have been brought to the capital by these visiting dignitaries. Whatever the source was, the result was not good for the royal family. Several of Akhenaten's daughters were seemingly claimed by it, 3 of whom, Meketaten, Neferneferure, and Setepenre, were daughters from his marriage to his principal wife Nefertiti. Others still may have been impacted. One theory which has also emerged in recent years is that the plague was ravaging Egypt years earlier, and that it may have actually been a cause of Akhenaten's religious reform program, the king having decided to embrace a new religion and God as the disease ravaged his country. This remains a hypothesis only, and there is little evidence to suggest the plague outbreak preceded the raising of the cult of Aten and the construction of Amarna. What Akhenaten died from himself is not known. There is, of course, a possibility that the plague took him when he died at some stage between 1336 and 1334 BC. It could also be that he was suffering from a lifelong illness. Egyptologists have long noted that on statues and other monuments and walls, he was typically depicted as being a much leaner and gaunt figure than other pharaohs of the New Kingdom period. Maybe this was how he wanted to be depicted, but it could also indicate he was suffering from something like Marfan's syndrome or Frolic's syndrome. Both are complicated conditions which are related to the endocrine system and other parts of the body. They would also both result in a long drooping face and jawline such as the one Akhenaten was presented as having. At the same time, there are contradictions to any such diagnosis. Frolic's syndrome, for instance, usually makes men sterile, and as we have seen, Akhenaten clearly did not have any problem having children. Given this, the more likely conclusion is that the unusual depiction of Akhenaten was wholly owing to his eccentric personality and the unusual art of the time, and not related to any illness of any kind. If this is the case, then his death in the mid-1330s BC at a relatively young age, perhaps being little more than in his mid-30s, was quite possibly owing to the plague that was coursing through Egypt at the time. He was buried at the royal tomb he had built at Amarna, though his mummy and sarcophagus were soon seemingly removed from there, and perhaps taken to the Valley of the Kings near Thebes for internment next to his ancestors. The argument for Akhenaten having been ill for some time prior to his death is strengthened when we consider that there was a co-regency or co-rulership being developed in the last year or two of his life. The co-rulers were Nefertiti at one point, and at another, Smenkhare. The identity of the latter individual is unclear. He may have been a brother of Akhenaten, or one of his sons of an unclear background. This is significant when it comes to the question of who succeeded Akhenaten. Having died a relatively young man, his children were very young to succeed him in the main, and this Smenkhare, if he was a brother of the pharaoh, may have been chosen as a temporary successor due to being older. Yet the chronology is deeply confused and unclear, and Egyptologists debate whether Smenkhare was dead himself before Akhenaten. What is clear is that Tutankhamun, the famous pharaoh whose gold death mask has become synonymous with ancient Egypt, succeeded around 1332 BC, just a short while after Akhenaten's death. He was a boy of no more than 9 or 10 years at the time, and is understood to have been one of Akhenaten's sons, though his parentage is debated. Though suffering from a genetic illness himself, he would live and rule down to the late 1320s BC, long enough to leave his own mark on Egyptian history in overturning many of his father's reforms. While the period immediately following his reign and the exact changeover of rulers in the years that followed is imprecisely known, Egyptologists broadly agree on what happened during these years. Tutankhamun's reign saw a violent reaction against the unusual religious system Akhenaten had inaugurated. The worship of Aten was broadly abandoned, although the worship of sun deities, of course, remained central to the restored polytheistic system. The capital was also returned to Thebes, but things went much further still. A wave of iconoclasm ensued in which efforts were made to erase any memory of Akhenaten and the religious aberration he was perceived to have overseen. Amarna was abandoned. Its temples and grand buildings were literally dismantled and paved over, though in doing so, the destroyers did a great job of preserving the city under the sand, and it has been possible for archaeologists to retrieve much of it in recent decades. Inscriptions on public buildings, temples, and monuments dating to his reign were erased. Statues and tombs which he had erected were defaced, often with the physical features of statues chiseled off. Official records were also evidently destroyed. This amounted to a concerted effort to destroy any memory of Akhenaten and the cult of Aten. So comprehensive was this campaign that it destroyed many records of Akhenaten's life and reign. One of the reasons why we have such limited knowledge of the circumstances of his early life and reign is owing to this effort to erase him from the historical record by his near successors. The campaign was quite effective. By the time of the long reign of Ramesses II in the following century, Egyptian society had largely forgotten the aberration Akhenaten had introduced. As successful, As this campaign of destruction was, it did not stop the emergence of new forms of monotheism in the Near East in the centuries that followed. Judaism in its full form emerged in the Levant by the 11th century BC. Not long afterwards, the Persian philosopher Zoroaster, or Zarathustra as 19th century German philologists like Friedrich Nietzsche termed him, established Zoroastrianism as a new faith which was prominent in parts of what are now Iran and Iraq for centuries to come. The religious system of the Greeks was clearly polytheistic, but some local cults to deities like Apollo and Athena were so powerful that scholars argue they constituted a form of monolatry. The entire system rested on a belief in Zeus as an alleged king of the gods. Christianity emerged later out of Judaism, but incorporating significant elements of the Hellenic system, with many scholars arguing that the idea of Zeus as a cloud, god who ruled over the heavens, was a major influence on the early development of the Church of the followers of Christ. Other quasi-monotheistic sun deities such as Elagabal and Helios became prominent under Roman rule in the 3rd century CE before being overtaken by the rise of Christianity as the state religion of the late Roman Empire. Thus, by the time of the rise of Islam in the 7th century, monotheism was the rule rather than the exception to the religious life of Europe, the Maghreb, and the Middle East. Akhenaten, rather than being an aberration, was something of a prophet of the future shift from polytheism to monotheism. Eventually, despite the best efforts of his children and other descendants to excise him from the historical record, details of Akhenaten's reign and religious innovations began to re-emerge. This began with the realization by 18th century European Orientalists visiting Egypt that there was a lost city on the site of Amarna, some remains of which were still visible above the sands. Archaeological excavations were undertaken there spasmodically in the 19th century, before the uncovering of the Amarna letters in the 1880s led to a more sustained interest in the Amarna site. Extensive studies were carried out here between the 1890s and the 1930s, and with this, the story of what Akhenaten had attempted began to reveal itself after millennia of obscurity. In the process, Akhenaten has become one of the most studied of all ancient Egyptian pharaohs, as his rule was so unusual. There nevertheless remain unresolved issues surrounding it. For instance, in 1907, a tomb codenamed KV55 in the Valley of the Kings west of Thebes was discovered, and was soon identified as the tomb of Akhenaten. A mummy was located here, and, as recently as 2010, scientific studies began to appear suggesting the mummy was most likely that of Akhenaten. Other Egyptologists have derided these claims, though, arguing that Akhenaten was buried at Amarna and would hardly have been removed to the Valley of the Kings if he were considered such an abhorrent figure following his death. As with much else concerning his reign, there are more questions than answers, even after centuries of historical inquiry. Akhenaten is one of the most well-known of the Egyptian pharaohs today for one reason: his efforts to establish a new religious system in which the sun god Aten would have a position of primacy. This was not simply a personal religious preference on his part. The pharaoh was so dedicated to the god that he tried to establish him as the preeminent deity across Egypt, changed his name to acknowledge the worship of Aten, and built a new city to honor the deity. This might not have been strict monotheism and should be described more as monolatry, where the other gods and goddesses were still acknowledged but made peripheral by comparison with the paramount god. It still seemed like an aberration to Akhenaten's subjects, and after his reign, his successors did their level best to eradicate any record or memory of what he had done. Yet it would be wrong to see this as an indication of insanity in Akhenaten. He knew what he was doing and deployed vast state resources to try to make it happen. In the end, what we might suggest is that his establishment of the cult of Aten was indicative of the changing religious and intellectual world of the cosmopolitan Late Bronze Age, one in which outside Semitic influences concerning sun deities were influencing Egyptian culture, and in the end, he was ahead of his time. Over the centuries that followed, there were numerous monotheistic faiths that emerged in the Mediterranean world and that of the Middle East. Though it would take another 2 millennia for it to occur, eventually they would conquer all before them. What do you think of Akhenaten? Was he something of an aberration and perhaps insane, as some of his contemporaries seem to believe? Or was he simply a visionary who predicted the general drift from polytheism to monotheism in the ancient world? Please let us know in the comments section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.